Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Mind Matters, Navigating Head Injuries and Concussions. We're going to delve into all things related to brain health and injury. I'm your host. My name is Kiley Como. I'm the firm's treatment coordinator and registered nurse. And today we've got a really fascinating episode for you. We're going to talk about traumatic brain injury, or TBI, in the context of car crashes and personal injury. Joining us today is Thomas Ozbolt, a seasoned attorney with extensive experience in personal injury law. Welcome, Thomas.
Hey, good morning, Kiley. How you doing?
Good, thanks.
Good to be here.
So today we're going to focus on delayed neurological complications that can occur after a head trauma, specifically those vascular disorders like what's known as arterial dissection or traumatic aneurysm. And these conditions can develop after an injury and have some really serious consequences. We're going to explore what these conditions are, kind of how they develop, their symptoms, some of the treatment options, and then we'll get into kind of some of the legal implications, where personal injury cases are related. So, Thomas, let's jump in. To start off, let's talk about what happens when somebody experiences a head trauma. All right, so can you explain it in simple terms for us?
Yeah, sure. When someone experiences head trauma, it can cause damage to blood vessels in the brain. And if you imagine those blood vessels as highways that are transporting blood to different parts of the brain, when those highways get damaged, just like in real life, it can lead to serious complications like arterial dissection or traumatic aneurysm.
I do love your analogies. They're simple and totally understandable. So that gives me a good picture. So let's talk about kind of what exactly are arterial dissections and traumatic aneurysms. Those sound scary.
Here's another analogy for you. But an arterial dissection happens when there's a tear in the inner layer of an artery wall. So if you thought of that like a small tear in a garden hose, you've got the blood then seeping between the layers of the artery wall, which can then block blood flow or cause that artery to burst. Now, a traumatic aneurysm, on the other hand, is when a blood vessel balloons out just due to the pressure of the blood flow. It's similar to what happens when you blow up a balloon too much. It can become weak and potentially burst.
I think one of the things that people don't really think about or understand about when you have a sudden traumatic impact, right, is that sudden stop, right? And that causes, think about when you hit the ground, what do? You bear down, right? You brace yourself. And so that is an incredible amount of pressure that builds up in your inside your chest, your abdomen, but especially in your brain. And so that makes sense, how that happens. You have that sudden increase in pressure, which kind of balloons out that artery. So let's talk about some of the complications that might occur after a head trauma.
So these complications, they can occur due to the impact of the head trauma. And for example, if someone hit their head hard on the steering wheel or the headrest in a car crash, that force could damage blood vessels in your brain. And same thing could happen with a rapid acceleration or deceleration force. Again, you don't have to hit your head to suffer a brain injury. But these forces or this blunt impact, this could lead to either a dissection or an aneurysm. Now, important to note, sometimes these issues, they're not going to show up immediately, but they're going to develop over time. So it might not be boom, immediate dissection or boom, immediate aneurysm. It can be something that comes downstream of the actual crash.
I think that's an excellent point. I think, you're in a crash. You kind of, all my fingers and toes are still there. I feel okay, but you can't stop there, right? You really have to be watchful. Some of what I've read and studied in the past, we talk about it, mentions there are specific symptoms or conditions associated with vascular disorders. So let's help some of our listeners understand that. Can you elaborate on some of that?
Yeah. So symptoms of these vascular disorders, they can vary. And, it's similar to other symptoms that you might get for other reasons. So it can be difficult to kind of parse these out. But for arterial dissection, typical symptoms will include severe headaches, vision problems, dizziness, and unequal pupils. Now, in some cases, that dissection can cause a stroke if it's not treated properly. So that could be a reason why we've seen it before. Somebody suffers a stroke in the aftermath of a car crash, where before they had never had one or didn't have some issues. But for traumatic aneurysms, the symptoms there can include sudden, severe headaches, nausea, vision impairment, loss of consciousness. And if an aneurysm ruptures, it can lead to a subarachnoid hemorrhage, There's a type of bleeding in the brain, and that can cause severe neurological deficits or even death.
In my experience as a neuro ICU nurse, those subarachnoid hemorrhage patients are probably some of the sickest patients, and they bear the most watching. The vast majority of those patients don't even make it to the hospital alive because of where that bleeding occurs in the brain and the increased pressure that comes along with bleeding in that subarachnoid space. So I'm glad you mentioned that. We're not trying to scare people into it, but we kind of are, right? If you're in an accident, have a traumatic brain injury potential, don't wait. You got to get to that hospital. So I've been in this accident. I've got some headaches. I've got some nausea. I need to get to the hospital. How are they gonna say yes, you have this condition? How do they detect that? And then what do they do to treat it?
Go to the emergency room after you've been involved in a crash. Like, don't take chances with your health. You only get one body, you only got one life. But in terms of detecting and treating those conditions, doctors often use imaging tests like the CT angiography or CTA, or the magnetic resonance angiography, MRA. These tests, they provide detailed images of the blood vessels in the brain. So if there's an arterial dissection or aneurysm and it's detected, treatment that can be administered would include medication to prevent blood clots or even surgery to repair the damaged blood vessel. And you might have some good information on that and what that looks like, with your position.
That bears the treatment of those, especially for a ruptured aneurysm. Those patients are always in the ICU. A lot of times you end up, the nursing staff, the doctors are managing your head to toe body, because you got to keep your blood pressure in very tight parameters, because a sudden increase in pressure can cause more bleeding, but too low of a blood pressure is not going to get oxygen to the areas of the brain that need it. So yeah, they are very, very sick patients. Some of the repairs you mentioned, the mechanical repairs where they'll go in, insert a catheter into a large artery in the leg and snake it all the way up to the brain and deploy coils, tiny little coils into that aneurysm to kind of fill that space. Or maybe they'll put a clip around the neck of the aneurysm if it hasn't ruptured yet. Just fascinating, innovative approaches to treating these things. So all to say, the treatment's there. You just got to get to the hospital to get it, kind of like you mentioned earlier, right? When you're talking about TBIs, some of these cases may involve some kind of unique underlying issues, like what's known as Marfan syndrome. Can you kind of explain how this relates to arterial dissections?
Yeah, one of the interesting things that comes into play in any personal injury case is this concept of pre-existing conditions, as the insurance companies love to try to ram into your brain. But really, that just means it's the person that you are. And when you have underlying issues with your health, the law doesn't say that, well, we're going to treat that person like they were normal, like they were 100% healthy, John Wick, Arnold Schwarzenegger, whoever it may be. It's, you have to take that person as they are. And so if you have someone who has a condition like Marfan's syndrome, that can certainly bring a higher risk of some of these issues, these vascular disorders that we've talked about that may arise from traumatic brain injury, particularly when we talk about arterial dissections. So Marfan syndrome, and you may be able to shed even further light on this. As I understand it, it affects the body's connective tissue, and that can make some blood vessels that you have more prone to tearing. And in some cases, for someone with Marfan syndrome, you might even have mild trauma that causes arterial dissection in these individuals. So if you think about mild trauma having the risk of causing something like that, and then you think about getting T-boned going through an intersection by somebody who's texting on their phone going 35 miles per hour, some very significant downstream implications of something like that.
I'm so glad you talked there about people with pre-existing conditions, because it's inevitable. The older we get, our health declines, generally speaking, across the population, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't get the treatment you need because somebody else made a mistake and ruined your life, just because you've got this pre-existing condition. You talk about Marfan syndrome, things like people on blood thinners, because they have like atrial fibrillation, they're on chronic blood thinners. If they get in an accident, the increased risk of bleeding in their brain or anywhere else is so high. But so again, as a healthcare practitioner, I can't tell you how much I appreciate, having an attorney. And that's why we need, firms like Shane Smith Law and attorneys like Thomas to step in the gap and advocate for clients, especially those with those pre-existing conditions. You need that care right away.
It might be simplistic to say this, but anybody who pre-existed before a crash has pre-existing conditions, because that's just the consequences of life. We all have our bumps and bruises and scars, and just from living. I mean, you see it all the time in the context of this made up disc disease. You know, everybody is naturally aging, and our bodies suffer wear and tear over the course of that. It's insurance company propaganda, and we don't buy it.
Why should we be penalized for being alive, you know, and just living day to day? Man, that gets me riled up. I appreciate that so much, Thomas.
So that's what we're here for, is, you know, people shouldn't be treated as less valuable because they're older or because they've had, you know, different issues that they couldn't control in their life. So someone with Marfan syndrome should be treated as 100% of the human being that they are, you know, made in the image of God, and, you know, just as valuable as anyone else.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to cut it a little short. This is a long episode, so please come back to join us for the next part, where we kind of go a little bit more in depth, talk about some real life cases. But as always, I would ask you to hit that like and subscribe button, hit that bell for some notifications to stay up to date on our latest content. And as always, if you're in pain, call Shane at 980-999-9999.
In pain, so I call Shane. 980-999-9999. In pain, call Shane.